Okay, I would love to welcome everyone to tonight's presentation. We have a really cool and interesting webinar for you tonight. It's a little bit different. We oftentimes talk about individual animals, but a number of our webinars focus on wildlife concepts, give you a better understanding of how animals function within their ecosystem. And tonight's topic is keystone species, which we're going to break it down into something really simple for you to understand. And so we're going to spend the next 45 minutes talking about this. I'll answer whatever questions you have, and hopefully you will walk away from tonight's webinar with a much, much better understanding of keystone species. So obviously I am today's presenter. My name is Daryl Radijak. I'm a wildlife biologist and large carnivore specialist. And just like always, I always do the background experience for myself or all the instructors, simply because there's a lot of folks that do join us for the first time, and it's really good for them to know that they're receiving instructions from people that have been doing this for a living, making a career out of it, making just demonstrating that we did study this stuff. We're not just sleeping in holiday inns to absorb all of our knowledge. So most of you know who I am, but just for anyone that has purchased this and is wondering who is speaking to you right now, again, my name is Daryl Radijak. I do have a degree in wildlife management, and I am a career wildlife biologist. I received my degree way back in 1992, which dates me, tells you how tremendously old I am. I started my career working in East Tennessee, just outside of Great Smoky Mountain National Park. I was the manager of a place called the Appalachian Bear Center. I did that for about 5 years. My passion for large carnivores truly developed from my time working at the Bear Center. Absolutely love bears and other large carnivores. But shortly after the Bear Center, I was hired on by the Tennessee Wildlife Resources Agency. It's because of my experience working with bears for the Bear Center. I was soon promoted to the big game coordinator for the state of Tennessee. So I was over all the bear, all the deer, all the elk within the state of Tennessee. So instead of managing individual animals, I was managing entire populations. That was a fantastic job. All my jobs have been fantastic, but that was an awesome job. I did that for about 7 years. Then the director of the agency saw something in me that I didn't see, obviously, and he promoted me to chief of wildlife. So instead of being over the big game animals, I was suddenly over all the animals in the state of Tennessee. That too was awesome. Did that for about 5 years, but when you get to that position, you can't go any higher, and you oftentimes get out of the field. And I put that picture up there to show you how much I really, really enjoy being in the field. So about 4 years ago, I ditched the state of Tennessee and headed west to fulfill a lifelong dream of living and working in the Rockies, and that's kind of what I'm doing here. I did add one bullet point. This is new because I never put this in a slide before, but we recently won the Gifford Pinchot Conservation Award for the U.S. Forest Service for our work with underprivileged wildlife students. And so really proud of that. And so I get to tell you all about that whenever I do these webinars now. So with that, we're gonna get started and jump into tonight's presentation. Like I said, we're going to be discussing keystone species. And so this is going to be really breaking down the basics. And so the first question you come up with, at least I came up with, is what the heck is a keystone? So like I said in the preamble today, or at least I love providing analogies to make things a whole lot easier to understand. And so before we start talking about keystone species, let's understand what a keystone is. And so a keystone actually comes from architectural terms. And so let's start building a structure. Pretend we're all architects and we build a structure. And so what we're building here is just a simple arch. And so we have all these blocks forming both sides of the arch. And that piece, that center piece in the middle, that literally holds that whole arch together, that right there is a keystone. It's a really, really important piece of a structure. And what happens is you have this keystone in there. If you were to remove the keystone, and we'll do that right there, the structure falls down. And so that keystone is a really important piece of a structure in order for that structure to function as it should. So hopefully that will explain why we get the term keystone species, because the keystone is that really important piece of a structure that keeps it together. So how does this relate to wildlife? Well, I showed you from an architectural side of things how that keystone holds together a structure, a building type of structure. So as it equates to wildlife, instead of talking about a structure, we're literally going to be talking about ecosystems. And so what it boils down to is a keystone species is literally that species that holds the ecosystem together. Now, it might not hold the entire ecosystem together, but it definitely holds a big part of that ecosystem together. And that's where the term keystone species comes from. It's that architectural piece that really holds a structure in place. And from the wildlife standpoint, that structure is the ecosystem. Wait a minute. All right. What I just got done telling you is a keystone species holds an ecosystem together, but haven't we always been taught that all species are important? And so why would one species be more important than another? And so I'll quiz you. Everyone know who that is? Anyone who doesn't know who that is? Let me know who that is if you know. I refer to him quite a bit. Most wildlife biologists will recognize him. Yes, thank you, Bet and Lori. Aldo Leopold. He's considered the father of wildlife conservation. So it was literally because of him we have the tremendous wildlife resources that we have today. He lived in the early 1900s, and he saw some major things wrong with our wildlife resources. Species were in decline or completely extirpated or even extinct. And we were abusing the land and the waters, and it was not going to be sustainable for wildlife resources in the future. And so Aldo Leopold was really the one that provided the wake-up call. And if you've never read any of his books, he's got a couple that are just phenomenal. Sand County Almanac is probably his most popular one. But besides being an amazing conservationist that identified the issues we had with wildlife, he is a tremendous writer. And so he's quoted all the time. There's just so many different things he stated in his career and in his writings that were just, gosh, that's so prophetic. That is the perfect saying. The reason I'm bringing this up, he had a saying I love that I use quite a bit, and I hope you could read that font. But Aldo was quoted as saying, to keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering, or it's the first sign of intelligent tinkering. And you sit there and trying to figure out what that means, and it's really simple. You got to keep all the parts to a system, and if you do, that's the most intelligent thing you can do, is keep all the parts in order for something to function properly. And so let's break this down. Again, we're not going to start talking about wildlife and all these different kinds of ecosystems. Let's look at a really simple mechanical system, these three wheels here. And so what we're trying to say here is each piece of this particular system is really important. We need each one of them. But believe it or not, there are some pieces that just so happen to be more important than others. And a good example of that, just looking at this graphic here, if you look at this simple single little cog in that blue wheel, if you remove that cog, guess what? Those wheels will still turn. It'll be a little clunky, might not perform at its peak, but it's still operational. It'll still work. It's an important little piece. However, if instead you remove an entire wheel there, you might have a system that begins to break down. And so all the pieces are important. And again, just like Aldo Leopold said, the first sign of intelligent tinkering is keeping all the parts. And so all the parts are important. I don't want to come off saying that some species just aren't that important. They're all important, but some are a little bit more important than others when it comes to keeping an ecosystem together. So hopefully that makes sense. Any questions about that? Okay. Just so you know where this whole idea, this whole concept of Keystone Species originated, there was a gentleman who did a lot of work in the 1960s. He was an ecologist by the name of Robert Payne. It's actually funny that we were talking beforehand regarding where sea otters survive, and that's up in the Pacific Northwest is one of their primary areas. Robert Payne did a lot of work up in that area as well, and he was one of those ecologists that loved tinkering and thinking about things. And where he lived close by these tide pools. And so the tide would come in along the coast, the Pacific coast, come in, fill up these tide pools, and then leave. And he had each one of those little pools that was created was a little, think of it as kind of like a little ecosystem in and of itself. Now, some of these pools might have been 10 feet wide, some of them may have been 100. But he began tinkering there with those individual little systems because each one they were very similar, but each one could be controlled. So you had two identical ecosystems next to each other, like two different tide pools. And so what he did, he started playing with these purple starfish. And he had a control pool where he didn't touch anything. And if you looked inside both of the tide pools, or all the tide pools in that area, it was ripe with all these different species. You had starfish, you had mollusks, you had little fish, you had all this algae and plant life, and all these different organisms surviving within these tide pools. And so what Robert Payne started tinkering with is he fooled around, and in one of those pools, every time he saw a purple starfish, he would pull it out and put it in a different pool. So he had one of these pools that he always just kept removing the purple starfish because he wanted to see what happened to that tide pool if you just removed one species. And lo and behold, after time, I don't know how long it took, but what had happened is those starfish used to prey upon this one type of mollusk that was in that pool. It was one of many species in that pool. But upon removing the starfish, that mollusk never had anything preying on it. And so those mollusks began reproducing, and soon they were out competing. They were eating a lot of the stuff in there, and before long, that tide pool that he removed the starfish was suddenly completely covered up with this one species of mollusk that reproduced and ate everything out of house and home. And so that tide pool suddenly had a tremendous loss in species diversity because it was mostly just mollusks. You didn't have all that other plant life, those other crustaceans, everything else there. It became, when we're talking about species diversity, it went from having dozens and dozens of species in there to just a few, and it was mostly dominated by that mollusk simply because he removed that one species, that purple starfish. And so that is when he finally came up with this concept of a keystone species. And literally what it means is a keystone species has a disproportionately large effect on its environment relative to its abundance. So you remove one species and it has a tremendous ripple effect with all these other species. Now, there are some species, for example, you could remove a species and things still chug along. It's kind of like that simple cog in a wheel. You remove some species and it still functions. You really don't notice much of a difference. But if you remove a keystone species, things get out of whack disproportionately. And it could happen relatively quickly too. So Robert Payne, this ecologist in the West, developed this concept of keystone species. And it's been studied more and elaborated on much more over the past 50 years or so. Okay, so this is going to be my pride and joy of some of the slides I've been working on the last couple of days. So sit back. Any question about Keystone Species, where it comes from, what it means? Because I'm going to paint a picture now. Instead of using the analogies of wheels or architectural structures, I'm going to start talking about ecosystems. I see Lori typing something. All right. As Lori's typing, I'm going to go to my next slide. So literally what I want to do over the next few minutes or whatever is show you, like I said, instead of using an analogy, I'm going to show you what this means from a wildlife perspective. Okay, Lori asked a question. So could there be less actual members of a keystone species than others in the ecosystem? I think I'm understanding. There are some species, well, for example, and tell me if I get this right or wrong, apex predators are oftentimes keystone species. And when you look at apex predator, their density is really, really low. So you don't have to remove many of them. A lot of it has to do with predator and prey populations. And so there are some species where their numbers are actually pretty low. And even though you remove just a few of them, it has widespread ramifications. I don't know if I answered your question correctly. Okay. Okay. So let's do this example of what this looks like from an actual wildlife perspective. So here is an ecosystem I created, and we're going to pretend this is an ecosystem out west. And that's what it looks like. And generally when I'm talking an ecosystem, it's not just the plant life. It's everything from all the vegetation to all the animals, all the insects, even the abiotic things like rocks, um, anything that's not alive is also part of that ecosystem. Now, for this demonstration, obviously I can't draw in all the animals within this ecosystem, but this will give you an idea of what it generally looks like. Now, remember, an ecosystem, one of the primary aspects of an ecosystem is the habitat. And habitat is composed primarily of that vegetative structure. So this is our demonstration ecosystem. And like I said, this is going to be kind of like a Western ecosystem. And so I'm going to throw some animals up here that would be found in this ecosystem. So let's start by looking at some of the species that we may find in this demonstration area. And so we'll have a species like beavers, but we're not just solely talking about beavers. We will for a second, but this will represent a lot of the small mammals. We're going to have lots of different songbirds in this ecosystem. We're going to have herbivores. It won't just be elk. You might have mule deer. You might have antelope. Just some of those large-bodied herbivores would be within this ecosystem. We'll have small mammals like mice, voles, any of those tiny critters, birds of prey, and we'll also have some carnivores or apex predators. And by no means does this cover all the animals that be found. These are just examples of what kinds of species we may find within this ecosystem. And so let's start looking from left to right. What would happen if we lose one of these animals from this system? And we'll start with the beaver. Now, first off, if we were to remove the beaver, obviously it's bad for beavers, but what kind of impact would that have on the ecosystem? On this particular ecosystem, and I'm going to differentiate a little bit later, but on this particular ecosystem, this is a really big system. It has rivers and trees and plains and mountains and all that. If we lost beavers, here's something to think about. What do beavers will eat trees? They especially like aspen trees. So if you remove the beavers, now watch the screen. If you remove the beavers, you might have more aspen trees grow up. Won't be a ton more because they're not eating that much of the trees, but it might grow up a little bit thicker with the aspen trees. But overall, there really hasn't been that tremendous of a change within that environment. Okay, what happens if instead of losing beavers, we lost a cardinal species or a grosbeak, some kind of songbird. Um, no offense to any of the songbirds out there, but if we lose a species of songbirds, this is kind of like one of those little cogs in the wheel. It's probably not going to alter the ecosystem all that much. And so there probably won't be that much effect to the overall look of what that ecosystem looks like. Now, what would happen if we lost the elk or the herbivores within the system? Now, understand these are eating machines. And so if you lose the elk, these herbivores oftentimes keep vegetation down. But if you lose the elk, what's going to happen is you're going to have more trees grow up. So it might get a little bit thicker. But overall, it's still not going to have a tremendous effect. There's other things that could keep the vegetation at bay, from natural fires to insect and disease breakouts. Things will keep some of the vegetation at bay. So again, it'll have a little bit of effect, not tremendous. Then let's move over to the mouse. If we lose a mouse species, yeah, it'll affect a couple other species that might feed on it, but overall, not a tremendous effect. Same thing with the birds of prey. There will definitely be some species that aren't too happy or are happy that a bird of prey is no longer present. But overall, on the ecosystem, not much effect. And last but not least, let's talk about the wolf. What happens if you take the wolf out? What is the one thing that wolves like to feed on? And you could use the examples that I have up there. The elk and beaver, absolutely. And so when it comes to managing, especially in the absence of man, when it comes to managing the population levels of elk and deer, typically in many places, humans can do that with the hunting seasons, but there's lots of places, for example, Yellowstone National Park, where you're not allowed to hunt. And so there's no control. If you were to lose that wolf, there's no control over how many elk and deer and bison are out there. That's one thing I forgot to mention, bison as well. Those large herbivores that are eating a lot of the vegetation out there. When you lose that control, you lose that apex predator that monitors or keeps their population in check. Now watch the screen. What happens is the elk begin reproducing and getting overpopulated, and you're going to start to lose some of the vegetation. That elk keeps on growing. The elk population keeps on growing. With the absence of wolves, there's nothing preventing those elk populations from growing larger and larger. And the thing is, these large herbivores, given their size and simple mass, the volume, the biometric mass of these large herbivores, you can have serious effects on the overall ecosystem. And so this is literally what we saw in Yellowstone National Park. And I'll be the first to admit, when you went to Yellowstone National Park in the 80s or early 90s, even then it was gorgeous. It was beautiful. But it was more like you were visiting a golf course because there were wide open spaces. The grass was neatly mowed down. There was elk and bison all over the place. And so those large herbivores created this very zoo-like, very manicured type of setting. And at the time, the people going there thought it was absolutely gorgeous. However, from a wildlife standpoint, from wildlife ecology and what that system should look like, many people knew that it was overgrazed, especially by the elk and the bison, and things were out of whack. Now, to the untrained eye, you would never notice this. And so in the 1990s, what the Park Service did is they restored gray wolves to the Yellowstone ecosystem. Now, the wolves will keep the elk population in check. Now, they don't wipe out the numbers. A lot of anti-wolf people will say that the wolves just decimated the elk population. And there was a decrease, but it had a whole lot more to do with than just wolves. There was a lot of climatic stuff going on. But one of the things that it does is it changes the elk behavior. And so you have these wide open areas and you are now an elk, but there is a threat of being eaten by a pack of wolves, you're not going to be so keen on being out in the middle of the field exposed where those wolves can see you. You will stick further and further away towards the timber. And what happens then is it allows those ecosystems or the plant life to return. And so by restoring that one species of gray wolf, it allowed a lot of that vegetation to return. And guess what happens when that vegetation returns? It attracts uh, small mammals. It attracts other songbirds, amphibians, reptiles. It creates much, much more biodiversity by putting that wolf back on the landscape. So, does that make sense to everybody? And so, literally, that keystone species is a species that truly, just like that keystone piece of the architecture, that keystone species holds the ecosystem together. All right. I hope you appreciated my graphic. It took me half a day to get it right and to figure out how I was going to do that. So, all right, what we're going to talk about now for a little bit is we're going to talk about different examples because there's, believe it or not, there's actually different kinds of keystone species. So let's start. I'm going to talk about 4 different kinds. The first one we just talked about, but it's literally a keystone predator. And what that is it's a species that keeps other animals in check. And if you recall some of the other lessons that we've given over time, in a couple of different ones, I'm not remembering right off the, I think it's predator prey type of stuff. We talk about the trophic levels. And so at the very bottom is the vegetation. That's what feeds the whole system. So the lowest trophic level, you have the plants that get eaten by the next trophic level, which oftentimes are the herbivores. And so it's that pyramid as far as the numbers go. And so you have all the plants being eaten by the herbivores, and then the top of that pyramid are the predators, especially the apex predators, because that is what keeps those herbivores in check. Now, every trophic level is really, really important, but the reason one of those, I say it's more important to have apex predators on your landscape than it is to have just a lot of the herbivores. The reason being, an excess of herbivores can do more damage by destroying that lowest trophic level, by destroying that plant life. Because when they start wiping out different plant species, there's a lot of other critters that are dependent on the vegetation. And so it's really important to keep that middle level, those herbivores, in check. And that's what the keystone predators do. And so oftentimes these are apex predators, whether or not it's the wolf, the cougar, grizzly bear. They're all considered keystone species for that reason is they make sure that another species, aka herbivores, don't get out of hand and start destroying the ecosystem. Molly, good question about the trophic. It's Trophic, and thank you for answering that, Lori. We do have, in fact, Stephanie Dennis, she's one of our instructors. She taught a class, it wasn't this past year, but last year, or this current year. Last year, Stephanie Dennis taught a class on trophic cascades. And so we have that recording available. It's really good. Stephanie is sharp as a tack when it comes to all that trophic, the trophic cascades that occur when you remove a species. So, okay, one category of keystone species are these keystone predators. Really important that we have these animals that keep these other animals in check. Believe it or not, there is another classification of species that are considered keystone modifiers. Now, in my example, I said that the beaver was not all that important, and it is, but what I was talking about there is scale. Because in my example, we were talking about that whole valley from the river to the meadows to the mountains and everything in between. on that scale, the beaver wasn't going to have that much of an impact. But now let's shrink that scale down and let's talk about, use a fancy word, riparian areas. Hopefully you have heard of that, but if you haven't, a riparian area is simply the waterways and the surrounding areas, the floodplains of those waterways. And so, like example, streams and rivers, those are all riparian areas. Now, if that was our scale, beavers are a tremendous keystone species because they have tremendous impact on that whole system. You all know what beavers do. They build dams, so they're literally modifying the entire environment. And so beaver dams are really, really good. When it comes to a river system, by slowing down the water, creating that big floodplain, you're bringing in a lot of aquatic vegetation, which is extremely rich as far as the number of species that can grow in there. You're also creating these pools for aquatic life, whether or not it's frogs or other amphibians, turtles, fish. They create the habitat for oodles and oodles of other aquatic species. So, having said that, when you have beavers in a system, usually it's a really healthy system, very diverse, lots of different species, lots of individuals within those different species. So if you remove the beaver, and over time those dams will break and breach, and the river starts speeding up, and you're going to start losing a lot of the species that were benefiting from that beaver's modifications. And so literally what a keystone modifier is an animal that literally modifies, that's the best way to put it, it modifies the environment that makes it more conducive to other species. And we're going to talk about examples of that. It's actually really cool. I think that's my favorite group of keystone species. All right, there is another classification of animals that can be considered keystone species. Now, we talked about keystone predators and how important those predators are at keeping the populations in check of those, that lower trophic level, those animals that are considered more or less herbivores. Believe it or not, you can have keystone prey species. And what those end up being is it's a species that feeds a lot of other species. And so there's certain things out there that all the animals eat. This is an example. Does anyone know what that is a picture of? And I'm going to dive in that marine side of things. It is not a shrimp. I think it's in the same family of shrimp, but think of these much, much, much smaller. This is what, believe it or not, everything from birds to fish to whales feed on this. That is actually krill, which krill can sometimes be almost microscopic. And so these animals literally fill the oceans. They have these huge school of krills. And so you get those baleen whales where they have this giant jaw opening up and they swim upward. It's crazy to have this animal that is literally tons and tons as far as weight goes, and it's feeding on almost these microscopic animals. But there's so many of them. There's millions or billions upon billions of these krill in the ocean, and that particular species feeds everything from whales to sea lions to fish to birds to a whole host of other species. So now you can see why that would be considered a keystone prey species, because if you lose it, all those other species that depend on it to feed suddenly find themselves in hard straits. And so that is a way in which a species that is considered a prey species can be considered keystone if there's a lot of other species that depend on it. Yes, Katie, that is great. You stole my thunder on one of my slides because I'm going to quiz you guys. But that is a great, great example, Katie, and I've got a picture of that coming up. All right, I'm going to tell you about the last one. There's actually a couple more, but I'm not going to go into those really obscure ones. I'm adding this last one just because I thought it was really, really cool. And this is one of those things that I love developing these new webinars because I research them for a week or two prior, and I always learn something new myself. But there are some species that are considered keystone species, and they're considered keystone mutualists. And it took me a while to understand what that was, but if you read about it, what it is, this is obviously a picture of a hummingbird. That's actually a cardinal flower, which is found in North America, but oftentimes in the tropics, you have a number of plants that have evolved over thousands and thousands of years. And if you look at the formation of that cardinal flower there, in order for it to be pollinated, you got to get something way down into that tube of that flower. Now, oftentimes insects can't even do it. So, literally, these flowers evolved needing a hummingbird in order to cross pollinate. So, it would require this hummingbird sticking its beak all the way or tongue all the way down to get the nectar, and then moving on to the next flower, next flower. So over time, the way these flowers evolved, they developed these types of flowers that can only be pollinated by a hummingbird. And so that suddenly makes that hummingbird super duper important. That's that keystone species. So if that species of if hummingbirds suddenly were no longer on that island, you have a number of plant species that can no longer be pollinated because they required that single use species in order to do the pollination. I thought that was really cool. I threw it in there. We're not going to talk about that much because there's not many examples of that, but I just thought that was darn cool. So, what we're going to do, believe it or not, that's all we're going to learn about from keystone species. It's as soon as you get the understanding of what they are and why they are considered keystone, you have no problem understanding and identifying other keystone species. So over the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to do a little quiz and we're going to talk about some of these animals we have up here. So I'm going to start really, really easy. So obviously, cougar. This is obviously a keystone species. What kind of keystone species? That would be the predator keystone species. Now, if you look historically, one of the things that I think is so interesting in North America, many of you joining in tonight are, I think, on the East Coast. There's a few on the West Coast. I know Pat's over by me. But on the East Coast, you have white-tailed deer populations. And prior to European settlement, deer were more or less held in check by a couple of different species. Cougars being one of them. We also had wolves over in the east, mostly red wolves. But there were apex predators that kept a lot of those white-tailed deer in check on the east prior to European settlement. What I found was really interesting, and this is something that kind of just evolved over the last few decades, is besides keeping the white-tailed deer in check, one of the things that the cougars did is they filled the niche and more or less kept coyotes at bay. So for hundreds of years, or maybe longer than that, coyotes were predominantly a Midwestern species in the plains and in the Southwest. That's mostly where you found coyotes. They had their niche. They occupied that niche. They did really well. And cougars on the east kind of fed on the deer. They also kept some of the coyotes at bay. And so over the last 150, 200 years, we lost cougars on the east coast outside of Florida. There's still a small population in Florida. But for the most part, excuse me, there's a big void after cougars disappeared. And so white-tailed deer populations exploded. Thankfully, we do have a means of controlling them with, since people like to eat them, we can control them that way. But you also see this mass migration, or we have seen this mass migration of coyotes kind of moving eastward. And so that's one thing that demonstrates where cougars can have a pretty large impact on the entire ecosystem if you take them out. Yeah, Pat, I think about that all the time as far as having both cougars and coyotes. Why the East Coast did not have really strong coyote or any coyote populations for a long, long time. It could have been, I don't know if it was, I would be remiss if I gave you an answer without fully knowing. So we do know in the absence of these other predators like the cougars and the wolves that the coyotes started filling in that niche. Since there's this big prey base, there's nothing there to keep them at bay. They just started their eastern march about a half a century ago. Yeah, we can get in discussions about the terrain. The thing with coyotes is they're extremely adaptable. They can live anywhere you put them. In fact, they're literally found all over North America right now. And why they weren't all over North America 200 years ago, the only thing we can come up with is that niche was already occupied, and they just didn't let these stragglers in. Okay, next one. Okay, first off, uh, yes, this I was going to ask you whether or not this was a keystone species, but considering I put it on my title slide, you probably would have answered it correctly. This is another keystone species. What do you think this classifies as? What kind of keystone species? Remember, there's predator, there's modifier, there's prey. We won't do any mutualistic. Oh, we have debate. Oh my gosh, Katie, you get the gold star. Trish, you do too. This is one that, right off the bat, a lot of people think the prey, and they did serve as prey for a number of those apex predators. But there was lots of other animals. Like when the bison disappeared, wolves still had deer. They still had elk. So you could make a small argument for them being a prey keystone species, but the biggest argument and the biggest reason why these are considered keystone species is their modifiers. Now, think about it, although the numbers sometimes vary, you often hear about how bison numbered in the tens of millions. Oftentimes you'll hear 60 million bison once roamed the Great Plains. You have to understand that is a tremendous biomass there, and that biomass is consuming a lot of plants. And so those bison, they're more or less modifiers of the ecosystem. They kept a lot of the plant life at bay because they would feed it. Now, understand a lot of these grasses need um, they'll need that grazing component, so they do better when they're grazed. And so the bison definitely will modify that vegetation, that biomass. But one of the things that I found was so interesting reading up about why bison are considered keystone species is just the sheer size of them. They'll often roll around, especially if you have muddy conditions. You're going to get some of these wallows, some of these depression, which then form these little microclimates, micro ecosystems that will fill with water and then become a habitat for a kind of frog or a kind of aquatic insect. So, believe it or not, bison are literally considered a keystone species because of their impact on the habitat. And so, bringing them back in or losing them, you definitely have major changes in the overall system. Molly, that's exactly it. Those little vernal pools, oftentimes we'll call them ephemeral pools. They're on the landscape for a little bit. They might disappear, but for the time that they're there, they provide tremendous habitat for a whole host of other species. Now, when the bison disappeared, there's nothing to form those little depressions. You don't have that large bodied animal causing these depressions. And so it just had a ripple effect. Usually, when you lose a keystone species, you lose a number of other species that you never expected to. And so, like I said, that's kind of the definition of keystone. It has a larger impact on all these other species than than anything else. Okay, next picture. This is one of my favorites. Keystone species. What do you think that serves? Or what kind of keystone species? Molly, was the question about the bison? The answer is no, either way. The bison and this prairie dog. This is actually a Gunnison's prairie dog. Bob Howdeshell took most of these pictures. Yes, this is definitely one that can be considered both. But if I were to put um, a tag on which one it is more of, I personally would say this is more of a modifier species. And this is one I was not very familiar with. Living on the East Coast, didn't have prairie dogs around, but where I'm at, we have these Gunnison's prairie dogs, and they're awesome. I love these things. They're stinking cute. But besides that, they create their own ecosystem. I should have put a picture of it in there, and I don't think I did. But imagine a prairie dog town. So imagine a big flat open meadow or field, and you have all these little mounds scattered all throughout that field, and you have this tunnel system that these prairie dogs create. Well, guess what? That tunnel system that they create suddenly becomes home to a whole host of other animals. First off, things like burrowing owls, really cool type of owl that lives on the ground. They cannot exist. Well, I shouldn't say they cannot exist. They prefer to create their nest in abandoned prairie dog towns. And so you need those prairie dogs on the landscape in order to have a really healthy population of burrowing owls. Now, a burrowing owl could make use of another animal's den, but for the most part, you find the vast majority of burrowing owls that are occupying prairie dog towns or abandoned prairie dog towns. Now, what do those prairie dog towns also do? They also allow the water to penetrate under the ground, and it changes the vegetation in that area. They also are a prey base, and many of you answered that. These prairie dogs are a tremendous source of food for things like badgers, for the black-footed ferret, which is an endangered species, for a whole host of small mesopredators from um, weasels, all these other raccoons. Um, they'll all prey on this species. So besides modifying the actual habitat itself and creating these prairie dog towns, that food source, you suddenly wipe out prairie dogs or remove them from the landscape, there's a whole host of other species that are really dependent on that prairie dog being there. And so that's a great example of a keystone species having widespread impact on a whole host of other species. No, nobody's failing tonight. Yeah, Pat, that I touched on it briefly, and I don't know the whole. I'm not a soil scientist, but I was reading up about how tremendously helpful these prairie dog towns are at getting some of the nutrients and the water filtration back on the landscape. And so losing those prairie dog towns, losing those prairie dogs that create those prairie dog towns, has widespread ramification. Perfect example of what a keystone species does. It has a disproportionate effect on the environment. Okay, not a great picture, but I think you'll understand what that is. Now, this is a picture of actual coho salmon, but someone else also brought up, I think Katie mentioned, um, which fish species did you mention, Katie? Because I'm going to talk about a couple. Okay, yeah, these coho salmon. These feed lots of critters. Obviously, one of the big ones bears love this, but there's a number of other animals, from birds to other fish. Now, understand, their whole life, these salmon are not this foot long, 18-inch long fish. Sometimes they're little fish that feed other animals, and so these are absolute great example of a keystone prey species. But I'm going to relate, and I use this not analogy. I've mentioned this effect a couple of times on a few different other webinars. One of the things that I found absolutely fascinating is when they were looking at some of the elk declines in Yellowstone, trying to figure out if it was solely caused by wolves or what was really causing the elk numbers to drop so precipitously. One of the things that they found out is a fish species could actually have an impact on it. And what it was man screwing things up, because we're really, really good at that. And so what they did in that greater Yellowstone ecosystem, they brought in a species of trout, a lake trout, because humans love fishing for those, so they thought it'd be cool to put those in the waterways around Yellowstone. And historically, instead of the coho salmon, historically in that area in Yellowstone, they had cutthroat trout. And those cutthroat trout would always spawn up the rivers. They spawn in really shallow waters. They'll swim upriver. And very much like these coho salmon, they provide a tremendous food source for a lot of the animals, especially the grizzlies that were found in Yellowstone. And so when humans introduced this lake trout, it outcompeted the cutthroat. So the numbers of cutthroat trout seriously dropped because the lake trout were eating most of the food resources. And when it comes time to spawn, the lake trout do not go into shallow water. They go into deep water. They go into the deepest parts of the lake to spawn. And so suddenly there is a change, and you no longer had this prey species, this cutthroat trout, swimming upstream because they weren't completely wiped out, but they're seriously diminished. And that had a ripple effect where the grizzlies no longer had that food source. And so literally what happened is the grizzlies, still needing the food, switched their diet over time. Didn't take too long, but it switched their diet to where they started feeding more on elk calves. And so more of a terrestrial diet as opposed to this aquatic diet. And so it just goes to show how things are so intricately entwined. And nature's so awesome, but this goes to show that some species, when you remove them, they have impacts that you never would have dreamed of. So I always mention it's crazy to think that elk decline could be somewhat attributed to a fish. It doesn't make sense, but until you explain it, then you're just like, oh, wow, that's pretty darn cool. So that's one way where that keystone prey species, like either a salmon or a cutthroat trout, they definitely could have far-reaching impacts that you never, ever, ever expected. Okay. Next picture. I learned this while researching for this. This is an American alligator. And, all right, guess, is a keystone predator, modifier, or prey? I know what y'all going to type, and I'll let you get by calling it a keystone prey species. But would you believe, I'm sorry, keystone predator species. Trish, I am so gosh darn proud of you. Why, all right, I'm going to put you on the spot now. Why would you call it a modifier? You're now wishing you never did. Oh my gosh, Lori, I didn't even. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I didn't know that. I haven't spent much time in the far southeast, like Florida, or some of the other southern states that have American alligators. And so when I was researching this, and it mentioned American alligator as being a keystone species, and I thought, okay, big, hungry predator type of thing. And then I was reading more about it, and exactly what Lori said. They go into these swampy areas, and they create these nests, which suddenly become an ecosystem for all these other critters. Oftentimes, they will wallow on the bottom and create these pools, which are then used by certain kinds of fishes. if they're in the reeds or swamp areas, they create those depressions that are used by insects. It was just amazing that they are considered one of the best modifiers of those, for example, Everglade ecosystems. And so the presence of that animal there literally has a tremendous impact on dozens of species that take advantage of these pools that are created by the American alligator. Dun dun dun. Okay, moving on. All right, Keystone Species or not. The reason I threw this up is because I put it on Facebook and I quizzed everyone. I think I went through I put 4 examples up on Facebook about which ones are Keystone Species. And I had the sea otter. I had, what did I have up there? The bison, the bighorn sheep, and the prairie dog. This is one. All right. I love honesty. No idea, Katie. Trish, you're getting the gold stars tonight. They're not really considered. They're charismatic megafauna. People love bighorn. They want to save bighorn, but they're not really classified as a keystone species. They're high altitude. They eat they eat things that most other animals don't eat. They're not a big prey base. Now, don't get me wrong, a mountain lion will eat a bighorn sheep, but they don't. Mountain lions mostly rely on deer and elk, mule deer and elk, but they will take a bighorn. But so they're not a big prey species. The plants that they eat, not many other animals really eat that stuff. They're in this really awful ecosystem, usually this alpine tundra, where not a lot of things grow. So even though they're a beautiful big animal, they're typically not classified as a keystone species. And so I threw that in there to throw everyone off. Yes, that is a great example, Lori. They have huge effect on people that just go crazy trying to see them. All right, let's get off North America. Elephants are considered a keystone species. Not many animals prey on them because they're too big to take down, but they are tremendous modifiers. Not only will they knock down trees, they'll they the depressions they make very similar to an alligator. They just create these little smaller type of ecosystems that benefit a lot of other different animals, from insect life to birds. They will change the vegetative composition by knocking down trees and allowing grasses to come in. So they're definitely considered a keystone species because they modify the habitat that they inhabit. Very much like the bison, yes. All right. This guy, we're not going to talk all about terrestrial. Um, I'll just jump right to it. This is obviously a keystone predator. This guy patrols the ocean. He keeps lots of different fish species populations. I don't know if they keep them in check, but one of the things that they're really important at doing um, in the world of evolution, you know that predators oftentimes prey on the sick and, more importantly, the weak. And so these sharks supposedly have a tremendous impact on these other species by being able to weed out the weak. Um, but when you're talking marine life, you always see that sharks are considered keystone species and their impact on the waterways. I wish I knew more about the marine ecosystems, but I want to throw that out there that doesn't all have to be terrestrial stuff. We have keystone species even within the marine ecosystems. Yeah, easy way to think about it. They are the apex predator. Okay, what about this guy? This was interesting because grizzly bears, I shouldn't say grizzly bears. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that. Brown bears, uh, just so you know, grizzlies are brown bears. Uh, it's not always interchangeable. Now, I will tell you that every grizzly is a brown bear, but not every brown bear is a grizzly. And if you don't know the difference between a brown bear and grizzly, I've got that I got a number of different webinars that differentiate those two. This is a picture of an Alaskan brown bear that Bob Howdeshell took. And right away, yes, he's a keystone species. And this was interesting. These bears don't really they're not big time hunters. They're not like the cougar or the gray wolf that are keeping some of these herbivore populations in check. They eat those animals, especially if they stumble upon them, especially if it's a carcass. But it's interesting to see how these bears are more or less considered gardeners. They're a lot of times when they're feeding on the salmon, they are bringing those salmon carcasses up along the shore, up along the bank, which is providing tremendous nutrients to the soils along those rivers, which then allows different plant life to grow because of the rich soils, because of the salmon. And the best term I saw is, we don't use this, but they said they're keystone gardeners. And so they have tremendous impact on these ecosystems in ways that you usually don't think of when you think of a grizzly. But they do tremendous value to lots of these more indiscriminate and obscure species that benefit from their feeding practices. I don't know if I would term that as mutualist. It could be. Now, the when I think of mutualist, or I think the way you should think of mutualist as well, Katie, is the mutualist. You have two species that depend on each other, and so in this case of the bear, it's not so much the bear is benefiting multiple species. In the case of the hummingbird, it's that hummingbird and a specific flower. Although there are multiple flowers, I guess you could call it that. I'm not going to argue with you. Anyways, I thought bears were cool because they're a keystone species, but not because of that apex predator of eating other animals, but for a whole different reason. All right, last but not least, what is this guy? Is he a keystone species? Predator? How about all of the above? They are definitely a modifier. They will change habitats. The one definition when I was looking up are how humans are classified as keystone species, and the one thing I read, they are what they called a hyper keystone species. And literally what that means, if anything's hyper, it's excessive, it's way above normal. And that's probably the best description because these critters, this species, this human species, has done more modification and has had more impact, not just the environment, but other species than any other species. So when it comes to a keystone species, it depends on how you look at it. We are absolutely a keystone species because we have that disproportionate effect on the environment and other species. But for the most part, all up until this slide here, it seems like it was beneficial. And I think someone can make an argument that because we are hyper and we modify and affect so many other species, we're too excessive. And I'd be in that camp to say that we oftentimes do more harm than good. But we definitely are considered a keystone species because we're having tremendous impact on the environment as well as many, many other species. Okay, I believe that was the last. So let me summarize today. I want to see my time. All right, I was worried that I didn't have enough to talk about. Let me summarize real quickly. So when we're talking about keystone species, that centerpiece there, that is the thing that holds the whole structure together, and that's what a keystone species is. It might not hold the whole ecosystem together, but it holds a big chunk of it together. And so that keystone species has this disproportionately large effect on its environment, relative to its abundance. The last part's not all that important. Just remember it has tremendous effect on all the other species as well as the habitat or ecosystem itself. Now we have different kinds of keystone species from the predators, which kind of keep other animals in check. And if you lose that predator, those other animals end up having a tremendous impact. But it's because of the loss of that keystone predator. You have keystone modifiers, things like that prairie dog, the buffalo, the alligator, just their existence and what they do to the habitat, to the environment, they create conditions that are conducive for a whole bunch of other smaller species typically. You also have those keystone prey species from krill to salmon, animals that feed a lot of other species are considered keystone prey species. And although we didn't talk about it much, I just thought it was a cool demonstration with a hummingbird. You have some of those mutualists in which one species depends, or a number of species depend on that one species. And the example we used was the flowers that have certain shape of their flowers designed solely for a hummingbird. You lose that hummingbird, and it has tremendous effect on the whole slew of flowers that are designed for that. So with that, obviously I give credit. Bob Howdershell provided a ton of pictures. That's sea otter picture is his as well. I did have to pull a couple from the Fish and Wildlife Service in which Bob didn't have photos of. Y'all know how to follow us on our Wildlife for You and how to sign up for classes. One thing I'm always asking, if you want to leave comment, many of you, thank you for leaving comments. But you could always leave more than one. You could go back if it's a new webinar, such as tonight. By all means, we welcome more and more comments. But follow us on Facebook for You, or Facebook. Follow Wildlife for You on Facebook or Twitter. Trish Stevens is on here. She's phenomenal when it comes to keeping up the Wildlife for You Twitter page. And let me get through this, and then I'll go to the chat box. Mark your calendars. Many of you know this. I think many of you are already signed up. This is the one I'm most excited about. This is the last one of the year. I'm going to take a short hiatus around the holidays, but it also gives me time to plan next year. But 2 or 3 weeks from now, December 5th, me and Kim Delosier, we're given another version of Bear Tales. We've done it 3 times. This will actually be Bear Tales 4. But literally, we are going to spend 2 hours. It's not just going to be the hour-long talk. We're going to spend 2 hours telling bear stories. I want Kim to take the lead. He's got so many more interesting bear stories than I do. But we're literally going to follow your lead. I put a question out there on the Facebook page to give me some questions to kick us off. But for the most part that evening, we're just going to spend answering your questions, going in whatever direction you want us to go. It's all about bears, very kid-friendly. It's a holiday special type of thing, kind of get you in a good mood for the holidays. And Kim's just phenomenal. If you never heard him talk, he's just a slew of information and just an all-around just fantastic guy. So that's Thursday, December 5th. Now, I will tell you, I've been working a little bit the last week. I don't know if you recall last year, but I put together a special Christmas package. Is a Black Friday package for all the webinar recordings. Last year we had 22 webinars that we had on recording. We now, after completing year 2, we now have 48. You see all 48 webinars that we have available. I'm putting together, Stephanie Dennis is helping me put together a package to put together for Christmas presents. If you have people that you have no idea what to buy them anymore and they love wildlife, we're going to have packages that will offer a bear package. So it'll have 8 bear webinars. We're going to have one that's all about critters. So it'll have foxes and cougars and bobcats and the birds and the wolves. And so we'll have a critter package. We're also going to have a package about some of our bear tales, the campfire stories, whether or not it's bear tales or the campfire talk we did. We're going to have another package about some of these wildlife concepts. So this Keystone Species, the trophic cascades. Anyway, I should be releasing that hopefully before Black Friday because it's going to be kicked off as a Black Friday deal. But if you're looking for that Christmas present for the person that loves wildlife, literally, you can even buy them all if you want, and it's going to be a tremendous deal because I think they're going to be about $2 a piece if you buy them all. But keep an eye; it's a neat gift idea for someone that you don't know what to buy for. So with that, I'm going to leave it there, and I'll keep it on this title slide and say, or not title slide, ending slide, and try to answer all your questions. I don't know. Let me know if there was a question that was asked. I'm going to go back and read. Okay, are bees mutualistic or mutualists? Uh, I don't know if there are other. Put it this way: bees are absolutely a keystone species. I don't know if. Well, let me think. Okay, put it this way: they're not a. I I'm going to answer your question. Bees are keystone. We need those. Things will fall apart if we were to lose bees. Um, but when you think about it, they're not a keystone predator. They're not a keystone prey species. They're not really a modifier. And so, yeah, if you're going to classify bees, they would be more mutualistic because those other plants, whatever flowers, are depending upon the bees for that pollination. And so, since bees make up such an important part of that process, they can absolutely be considered a keystone species, and it'd be because they benefit all those other species because of that pollination work. And so, yeah, I would absolutely say that would be considered more of a mutualistic relationship than anything else. All right. I'm not seeing any questions that really stand out. I think we addressed them all. I'm sorry for rambling. I have a tendency to ramble and ramble. Anyway, I hope you guys. Okay, Lori does ask something. She says, "You didn't say this tonight, but is a keystone species the same thing as an indicator species?" No, those are different. Now, I'm hoping that we're considering indicator species the same thing. Biologists in a lot of federal agencies or government agencies have what we use what are called indicator species. And an indicator species is something that is highly dependent on a specific ecosystem. And so, if we want to know, I'll use um, as an example, goshawk. It's this really cool type of bird of prey. They're very, very dependent on this ponderosa pine ecosystem. And so, if you want to know whether or not the ponderosa pine ecosystem is in good shape, you can monitor the goshawk. And so those are considered an indicator species. So if the indicator species is doing really well, then that indicates that the rest of the ecosystem should be doing well. And so all the other animals that depend on a ponderosa pine system should be doing well. So they are the indicator to let you know that the system is doing good. Now, absolutely, without a doubt, you can have an indicator species that is also a keystone species. But generally, when we're talking indicator species, it's to give you an inference of how well the rest of that ecosystem is performing. Trish asks, do bats fall under the keystone species umbrella? I know they prey on insects, but they are also pollinators. Yeah, I believe that might be a really interesting question, Trish, whether or not it's like an individual species that can be considered a keystone or the whole classification of bats. Because bats, as you know, play a tremendous role in a couple of things, not just pollinators, but maintaining insects. They feed tremendously on mosquitoes. And so it might not be an individual species of bat unless it's a really populous species. But bats in general are um, extremely important to the environment because they keep all these other things in check. I don't know if one individual species, like I said, is more important than another bat species, but bats in general are we need them in our ecosystem to keep things kind of on par with the way things should be. Yes, but beekeepers, yeah, that's their bread and butter, and so bees are tremendously healthy. I will say one of my good friends where I work now, his wife is a bee expert, and I keep hearing from them it's not as dire as being as what you're reading in the media. The bee species are not dying out like some people would like you to believe. Now, one of the issues we do have is honeybees are not a native bee, but we're always having issues with invasive species. But the bees are extremely, extremely important. I don't think we have to worry just yet about how uh, bee species are declining. It hasn't been as drastic as some people would lead you to believe. Lori asks, are black bears considered a keystone or indicator or both? Um, Now, I'm almost afraid to say this, but we oftentimes don't consider black bears keystone species. Grizzlies, we definitely do. Um, I don't want to disappoint you, Lori. We just don't have too many people that are calling black bears keystone species. Now, they're very charismatic. We want them. They are a good umbrella species or indicator species that lets you know that when you have black bears, um, the habitat's usually in really good shape. But here's something else to think about: black bears could live in urban areas as well, and so unlike some of these other species, like the grizzlies need these wide open, pristine, large landscapes in order to thrive. Black bears live in New Jersey, and so they're so opportunistic that, like I said, they're not going to tell you much information because they can live anywhere. So it might not tell you if the habitat's good because they can survive even when the habitat's bad. Um, Now, as far as the keystone species, what other species depend on the black bear? I'm sure you can make an argument, and just like everyone can make an argument for almost every species, to lay out how they impact other species. And so, if you want to keep believing that they're keystone species, I'm not gonna tell you not to. It's just these other species are much easier to identify the reason why they're keystone species. I'm sorry, Lori. Didn't you can keep believing that. It's but by all means, I tell you what, Lori, this is serious. If you can find out where you heard, where you read that, I would like to know. I've never heard that or read that, but if it's out there, I'm all ears. I'm just as much open to learning as everyone else. And in fact, these talks often teach me a whole lot more than I previously knew. All right, I am going to, just so you know, I'm going to stop the recording. Last but not least, thank y'all. You guys are awesome. I so appreciate the questions, the communication, the participation. I, I I think I like these smaller classes much better than some of those bigger ones. The bigger ones get a little rowdy and it's hard to sort through the questions. But you guys were absolutely fantastic tonight, and I thank you, and I hope to see you very soon. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording.